Get a mop. Sophia, that is all you are good for. My father's laughter echoed through the crowded steakhouse as he threw a janitor's application at my chest. My brother-in-law smirked, sipping his expensive wine, thinking he had finally put me in my place. But what they did not know was that the crumbled paper in my hand was not a humiliation, it was an invitation to my own kingdom. Less than 24 hours later, the CEO of the company they worshipped would walk past them to salute me. The look on their faces when they realized the freeloader they tried to shame actually owned their future was worth every second of silence. Before I tell you how I fired my own family, tell me in the comments if you have ever been the black sheep who secretly held the keys to the castle. Please hit like and subscribe for the ultimate payback story. It started at the Capitol Grill on a Tuesday night. My brother-in-law, Brad, insisted on treating everyone to celebrate his big promotion. He ordered the $300 tomahawk steak, without asking the price, his voice booming across the dining room so every table nearby knew he was the big man on campus. I sat quietly at the end of the table, trying to make myself invisible. My sister Chloe sat next to him, scrolling through Instagram with her long acrylic nails clicking against the screen. She looked me up and down, her lip curling in disgust. Sophia, really, it is a celebration dinner. You could have tried a little harder than a plain black t-shirt. It looks like you picked it up from the clearance rack at Walmart. She did not know my plain t-shirt was cashmere from the row and cost more than her entire sequined dress, but I just took a sip of water and said nothing. In my line of work, wealth whispers while insecurity screams, and my family was deafeningly loud. My mother Beatrice nodded in agreement, smoothing out her napkin. Chloe is right, dear. You are 32 years old. You need to start presenting yourself like a woman who wants a future, not a college student. Look at Brad. He is sharp. He is successful. He is everything we hoped you would be. I cut into my salmon, ignoring the familiar sting. For the last 6 months since I moved into their basement suite, they assumed I was broke and unemployed. They did not know I was on a mandatory garden leave after selling my tech consultancy firm for 8 figures and was currently finalizing the acquisition of a massive logistics conglomerate. To them, I was just Sophia the failure. When the check came, Brad made a theatrical show of slapping his corporate card on the leather folder. The bill was over $800. I got this, folks, he announced, basking in my parents' admiration. Then he turned his cold blue eyes to me, a smirk playing on his lips. But Sophia, why do not you cover the tip? It is only $200. You need to have some skin in the game. I mean, since you do not have rent or kids to worry about, it is the least you can do. I froze. I had my black card in my wallet, the one that could buy this entire restaurant chain, but using it would blow my cover. I reached for my purse, calculating how much cash I had on hand. My hesitation was all the ammunition they needed. My father, Marcus, slammed his hand on the table, rattling the silverware. Enough, he barked, causing the couple at the next table to jump. I am tired of this, Sophia. You act like a squatter in my house while your sister and Brad are building an empire. You eat our food, you use our electricity, and you sit there looking like a charity case. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. I pulled some strings at Vanguard today. The facility manager owes me a favor. They are looking for night shift cleaning staff. It is minimum wage, scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans, but it is honest work. You start tomorrow or you pack your bags tonight. The table went silent. Chloe giggled behind her hand. Brad leaned back, crossing his arms, waiting for me to cry or beg. I looked at the application. Vanguard Manufacturing. The very company my private equity firm had just quietly acquired 48 hours ago. My father wanted me to scrub toilets in a building I now effectively owned. The irony was so delicious I almost laughed. I looked my father dead in the eye, picked up the paper, and smiled. Okay, Dad. I will take the job. I will be the best cleaner you have ever seen. They thought I was surrendering, but I was just clocking in for the greatest performance of my life. The next morning, the air in our kitchen was thick with the smell of burnt toast and my father's looming ego. I stood by the coffee maker waiting for the dark roast to brew while my mother fluttered around the island preparing a protein smoothie for Chloe. She carefully sliced strawberries, placing them on top like a garnish for a magazine photo shoot, while my empty plate sat neglected on the counter. I needed to make a call that would set the stage for the next few hours, but I could not risk them understanding a single word of it. I pulled my phone from the pocket of my oversized blazer and dialed Jean-Luc, my personal attorney based in Zurich. As my father loudly complained about the price of gas while searching for his car keys, I brought the phone to my ear and switched effortlessly into rapid, fluent French. Jean-Luc commenced the audit immediately. I want a full freeze on the liquidity injection for Vanguard Manufacturing until I give the signal on the ground. Do not release a single cent until I see the books myself. My mother looked up from her gossip magazine, her eyebrows furrowed in confusion. Who on earth are you talking to, Sophia? And why do you sound like you are choking on a baguette? I hung up the phone quickly and grabbed my travel mug, turning to face her with a practiced, innocent smile. Just a language app, Mom. I am trying to improve my skills since I have so much free time on my hands now that I am unemployed. She rolled her eyes, muttering something about how I should focus on learning how to use a vacuum cleaner instead of speaking a dead language. The drive to Vanguard Manufacturing was 45 minutes of pure psychological endurance. My father Marcus drove his mid-range leased sedan like he was piloting a presidential motorcade, checking his mirrors constantly and sighing with the weight of the world on his shoulders. You know, Sophia, he started, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror with a look of heavy disappointment. I hope you appreciate what I am doing for you today. Most fathers would have kicked you to the curb by now, given your lack of ambition. I had to pull serious strings with the facility manager to get you this spot. Do not embarrass me. I stared out the window, watching the Atlanta skyline pass by. It was a beautiful morning, the sun reflecting off the glass towers of the financial district. My father had no idea that I owned 3 of the buildings we just passed, or that the very car he was driving was leased through a bank that was a subsidiary of my firm. I simply nodded, my face a mask of obedience. I understand, Dad. Thank you for the opportunity. He continued his lecture, his voice rising in volume as he warmed up to his favorite topic. The problem with your generation is that you expect handouts. You think you deserve the corner office just because you showed up. Real work. Sophia, is grit. It is sweat. It is doing the jobs nobody else wants to do. You need to learn that. You need to be humbled. I sat there silently, letting his words wash over me. The irony was so thick I could practically taste it. Here was a man who had been a mid-level logistics manager for 20 years, never rising above his station because he was too stubborn to adapt, lecturing a woman who had just orchestrated a multi-billion-dollar hostile takeover about work ethic. But I kept my mouth shut. The reveal would be sweeter if I let him dig his hole a little deeper. As the gleaming glass structure of the Vanguard headquarters came into view, my father suddenly swerved the car toward the curb about 2 blocks away from the main entrance. The tires screeched slightly as he came to an abrupt halt. Get out here, he commanded, unlocking the doors. I looked at him confused. But Dad, the employee parking garage is right there under the building. Why are we stopping here? He shook his head vigorously, his hands gripping the steering wheel tight. I am not driving up to the front door with the cleaning lady, Sophia. People respect me there. I have an image to maintain as a manager. I do not want the vice president or the shift supervisors seeing me drop off someone who is going to be scrubbing the toilets. It reflects poorly on my professional standing. Walk the rest of the way. It will build character and give you time to think about your life choices. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the cold morning wind biting through my blazer. I watched him drive away, merging back into traffic without a backward glance, leaving me standing there on the corner. I adjusted the strap of my laptop bag, which he assumed contained a ham sandwich and a romance novel, but actually held the encrypted keys to his company's entire financial database. I began the walk to the building, my heels clicking rhythmically against the concrete. With every step, my resolve hardened. He wanted me to be humble. I would show him humble, but not in the way he expected. I walked the 2 blocks, keeping my head high, ignoring the curious glances from other commuters. When I reached the massive revolving doors of Vanguard, I took a deep breath. This was the first time I was entering the building not as a silent investor on a Zoom call, but in the flesh. I stepped into the polished marble lobby, which smelled of floor wax and expensive cologne. It was a cavernous space designed to intimidate visitors and project power. "Excuse me, miss." A large security guard in a dark uniform stepped in front of me, blocking my path to the elevators. His name tag read Miller, and he looked bored and irritated. "Deliveries are around the back. No food couriers in the main lobby." I stopped, adjusting my glasses. "I am not a delivery driver. I am here for work." I tried to step around him, but he shifted his weight to block me again, crossing his massive arms. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my plain clothes and lack of a visible ID badge. "Employee entrance for support staff is side door B near the loading dock. The lobby is for executives and clients only. You do not look like either." I was about to reach into my bag and pull out the letter of authorization that would make his face drain of color when a familiar, annoying voice echoed across the lobby. "Officer, it is okay, let her in." I turned to see Brad strolling through the automatic doors, holding a latte like it was a trophy. He was wearing a suit that was slightly too shiny, and his hair was gelled to perfection. He walked up to the reception desk, flashing a winning smile at the young receptionist, who blushed immediately. "She is with me, sort of." He laughed, leaning his elbow against the marble counter casually. "This is my sister-in-law. She is a little bit slow, if you know what I mean." He tapped his temple with his finger, making a mocking gesture while looking at the security guard. "We finally got her a job with the janitorial crew just to get her out of the house. She gets confused easily, so just point her toward the mop closet and she will be fine." The receptionist giggled, covering her mouth with her hand. "Oh, that is so sweet of you to help her out like that. You are a saint for taking care of family." Brad winked at me. His blue eyes filled with condescension. "Go on, Sophia. Don't keep the toilets waiting. They aren't going to scrub themselves." I looked at Brad, then at the security guard, and finally at the receptionist. They were all smiling, sharing a moment of superior amusement at my expense. I tightened my grip on my bag and forced a small, polite smile. "Thank you, Brad. I will be sure to remember this kindness." He laughed, waving me off as he headed toward the elevators. Yeah, just try not to slip on the wet floor." I watched the elevator doors close on his smug face. I took a deep breath and turned back to the security guard, who smirked and pointed a thumb toward a nondescript gray door in the corner. "Closet is that way." I nodded and walked toward the door. But I wasn't going to the janitor's closet. I was heading straight for the service elevator that led to the executive suite. It was time to introduce myself to the CEO. The desk Sterling had assigned to me was a masterclass in corporate humiliation. It was a small, wobbling particle board station shoved into a drafty corner of the hallway, situated right between the noisy break room and the men's restroom. A week ago, I would have fired the office manager for even allowing such a piece of furniture to exist in my building. But today, it was perfect. From this vantage point, I was invisible. Executives and managers walked past me without a second glance, their conversations continuing uninterrupted, because to them, I was just part of the scenery, as insignificant as the water cooler or the potted plant. They didn't know that the computer terminal sitting on my desk, which looked like a relic from the last decade, had been quietly reconfigured by the IT head an hour ago to have root access to the central server. I sat down, smoothing the skirt of my cheap suit, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. The heavy double doors at the end of the hall swung open and Brad emerged. He didn't walk, he strutted. There was an air of frantic energy about him today, the kind that comes from a man who is juggling too many lies and is terrified of dropping one. He spotted me immediately. His eyes narrowed, and a cruel smirk played on his lips. He adjusted the expensive watch on his wrist, a watch I knew he couldn't afford on his reported salary, and marched straight toward my sad little desk. He was carrying a thick, disorganized stack of documents that looked like they had been shoved into a binder at the last minute. He stopped in front of me, looming over the desk to maximize the height difference. He didn't say hello. He simply let the heavy binder drop from his hand. It landed on my desk with a loud, aggressive thud that made my computer monitor shake. The papers splayed out slightly messy and chaotic. "Photocopy this," Brad commanded, his voice loud enough for the secretaries down the hall to hear. He wanted an audience. He wanted everyone to see exactly where I stood in the food chain. "I need 50 copies for the board meeting at noon, collated, stapled, and placed on the conference table before I walk in." And Sophia tried to be quick about it. I looked up at him, keeping my face blank, masking the sharp intelligence in my eyes with a veil of submissive confusion. "50 copies, sir?" I asked softly. "That is a lot of paper. The machine might overheat." Brad laughed, a short barking sound. "It is not nuclear physics, Sophia. It is a copy machine. Even you should be able to handle that. Just press the big green button and try not to break anything." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper that only I could hear. "Do not embarrass me today. Marcus thinks hiring you was a joke. Prove him right and you are out on the street. Prove me right and maybe I will let you clean up the coffee cups after the meeting." He turned on his heel and walked away, not waiting for a response. He assumed I had none to give. I watched his back as he disappeared into his office, slamming the door behind him. He thought he had just assigned me a punishment, a mindless task to keep the little woman busy while the men did the real work. He had no idea he had just handed me the keys to his destruction. I picked up the binder. It was heavy, warm from being held in his sweaty grip. I walked to the copy room, a small windowless space that smelled of ozone and toner. I set the binder down and opened it. It was the supplementary budget report for the upcoming quarter, the detailed breakdown of expenses that usually got glossed over in the big meetings. Brad assumed I would just mindlessly feed the sheets into the feeder, staring at the wall while the machine did the work. He was wrong. As the copier began its rhythmic, hypnotic whirring, flashing bright light across the glass, I began to read. I scanned the pages with the speed and precision that had terrified my competitors in the takeover market. I wasn't looking at the words. I was looking at the patterns. The labor costs were standard. The utility estimates were within the margin of error. But then I turned to the procurement section, the invoices for raw materials being used in the new Vanguard skyscraper project. I stopped. The machine hummed impatiently, waiting for the next page, but I held the sheet in my hand, my eyes narrowing. It was an invoice for high-grade structural steel and industrial cement. I knew the current market rates for these materials down to the cent. I had just authorized a massive purchase order for a project in Dubai 3 days ago. The numbers on the page in front of me were impossible. According to this invoice, Vanguard was paying 300% above the market average for steel. I blinked, thinking perhaps I had misread the quantity. I checked again. No, the quantity was standard. The price per unit was astronomical. It was daylight robbery. Who signs off on this, I wondered, flipping to the bottom of the page. There it was. Brad's signature scrawled with arrogant flourish. I looked at the vendor name at the top of the invoice. Apex Global Supplies. The name sounded generic, forgettable, the kind of name you give a company when you don't want anyone to ask what it does. But it triggered a memory. A few years ago, when Brad and I were still together, and he was constantly complaining about being broke, I had seen a letter on his kitchen counter. It was a registration confirmation for a limited liability company. I remembered asking him about it, and he had snatched it away, mumbling something about a side project for a friend. The company name on that letter was Apex Global Supplies. My heart began to beat a slow, cold rhythm against my ribs. Brad wasn't just incompetent, he was a thief. He had set up a shell company, was buying materials at market price, and then selling them to his own employer at a 300% markup, pocketing the difference. It was a classic embezzlement scheme, bold and incredibly stupid, relying entirely on the assumption that no one would look closely at the invoices of a project that was already over budget. I looked at the address listed for Apex Global Supplies. It was a P.O. box in a district known for cheap rent and dubious businesses. I quickly memorized the vendor ID and the invoice numbers. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a crime. This was the reason the company was bleeding cash. This was the reason they were laying off staff while Brad bought new cars. I felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but I pushed it down, compressing it into cold, hard determination. I fed the damning page into the copier. The machine flashed, capturing the evidence of his fraud. I watched the copy slide out into the tray, warm and crisp. "You fool," I thought, staring at the duplicate. "You arrogant, greedy fool. You handed me the murder weapon. You thought I was too stupid to understand what I was looking at. You thought I was just a pair of hands to push a button." I finished the job. 50 copies. A thick stack of evidence multiplied 50 times, ready to be distributed to every member of the board. I collated them perfectly, stapling each packet with a satisfying crunch. I wasn't just preparing handouts for a meeting anymore, I was preparing the noose. I picked up the heavy stack of papers, balancing them on my hip. I checked my reflection in the dark glass of the copier. The woman looking back at me didn't look like a victim. She didn't look like a scorned ex-girlfriend. She looked like a predator who had just caught the scent of blood. I walked out of the copy room and back down the hall toward the conference room. Brad stuck his head out of his office door as I passed. "Are they done?" he barked, not even looking at me, his eyes glued to his phone. "Yes, sir," I said, my voice sweet and obedient. 50 copies, just like you asked. Everything is exactly where it needs to be." "Good," he grunted, disappearing back inside. I walked into the empty conference room. The long mahogany table gleamed under the lights. I began to place the packets at each seat. One for the CFO, one for the head of legal, one for Marcus, and of course one for Brad. I placed his right at the head of the table, ensuring the page with the Apex Global Supplies invoice was just slightly askew enough that if he looked down, the exorbitant number would be the first thing he saw. I took a step back and admired my work. The trap was set, the bait was laid, and the rat was about to walk right in. I smoothed my skirt, adjusted my badge, and walked out to my little desk in the hallway to wait for the show to begin. Being a special assistant was turning out to be the most exciting job I had ever had. The Sunday roast sat heavy in my stomach, a perfect culinary metaphor for the atmosphere at the dining table. My mother Beatrice had insisted on this family dinner to celebrate my new employment, though the celebration felt more like a tribunal where I was the defendant and they were the judges. Marcus sat at the head of the table, carving the chicken with an aggression that suggested he was imagining it was a competitor's neck. He had spent the last 20 minutes rewriting history, transforming his terrified fumbling in the lobby into a masterclass of corporate influence. "You really should thank me more often," Sophia Marcus said, pointing a grease-slicked knife in my direction. "Mr. Sterling would not have looked twice at a resume with a 5-year gap if I had not pulled him aside personally. I told him, Arthur, she is family. She is a bit rough around the edges, but give her a chance to fetch coffee and file papers." He listened to me because he respects my judgment. I took a slow sip of water to hide the smirk threatening to break through my composure. The delusion was breathtaking. He actually believed it. He had convinced himself that the CEO of a multinational conglomerate bowed to me because of a suggestion from a mid-level manager. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, my voice smooth and devoid of sarcasm. "I am sure your influence was the deciding factor." Beatrice beamed at her son, her eyes shining with that predatory pride she reserved only for him. "See, Sophia, you are so lucky to have a brother who looks out for you. You need to work hard and not embarrass him. No more of your disappearances." I was about to respond when Chloe breezed into the dining room looking like a storm cloud in designer heels. My younger sister, the baby of the family, the one who had never been told no in her entire life. She threw her purse onto the sideboard, narrowly missing a vase, and slumped into her chair. She didn't greet anyone. She just let out a dramatic, long-suffering sigh that was meant to stop all conversation. "What is wrong?" Princess Beatrice asked immediately, her voice dropping to a coo. "It is a disaster," Chloe whined, picking at a bread roll. "My Mercedes is in the shop again. Some idiot scratched the bumper, and now the dealer says they need to keep it for 3 days to match the paint. I have the gala tonight with the girls. I cannot take an Uber. It is humiliating." She turned her gaze toward me, her eyes narrowing as she calculated my utility. "Sophia, give me your keys." I paused my fork halfway to my mouth. "Excuse me, your car," she said, snapping her fingers as if waking a servant. "It is just that boring gray sedan, but it is better than a taxi. I will take it for the night. You are not going anywhere anyway. You never go anywhere." I carefully placed my fork down. It was true I drove a gray sedan. To them it looked like a sensible mid-range vehicle suitable for a personal assistant. What they didn't know was that it was a custom-built armored vehicle with a reinforced chassis, bulletproof glass, and a biometric security system that cost more than this entire house. But more importantly, the trunk was currently filled with the 50 copies of the incriminating financial reports I had prepared earlier that day. "I cannot do that, Chloe," I said firmly. The table went silent. Beatrice looked at me as if I had just slapped her. Marcus stopped chewing. "Why not?" Chloe demanded, her voice rising an octave. "Because it is a company vehicle now." I lied smoothly. "I have strict orders not to let anyone else drive it. And the trunk is full of sensitive client files that I need to organize over the weekend. I cannot risk them getting lost or messy." Marcus laughed, a condescending sound that grated on my nerves. "Sensitive files, Sophia, please. You are photocopying lunch menus, not handling state secrets. Just let her take the car. Do not be difficult." "It is against protocol, Marcus," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "You of all people should know how strict the company is about compliance." Beatrice slammed her hand on the table, rattling the silverware. "Enough of this nonsense. You are being selfish, Sophia. Always so selfish. Your brother gets you a job, puts food on your table, and you cannot even lend your sister a car for one night. Where is your gratitude? You are trying to sabotage her happiness because you are jealous. I am not jealous." "Mother," I said, standing up, "I am responsible. There is a difference." I picked up my plate and walked into the kitchen, dumping the uneaten food into the trash. I could hear them muttering behind me, the familiar chorus of complaints about my attitude. I needed a moment to breathe. I needed to wash the grease and the toxicity off my skin. I left my handbag on the kitchen counter, a calculated risk, and went upstairs to the guest bathroom I was allowed to use. I turned on the shower, letting the water run loud enough to mask any noise, but I didn't get in. Instead, I sat on the edge of the tub and waited. I knew them. I knew their boundaries were non-existent. I knew that the word no was just a challenge to them. Downstairs, the scene was playing out exactly as I anticipated. Chloe was likely pouting, Beatrice was likely soothing her, and Marcus was likely telling them to just take the keys because I wouldn't dare do anything about it. Sure enough, 5 minutes later, I heard the front door slam. I moved to the bathroom window, which offered a perfect view of the driveway. Chloe was marching toward my car, swinging my keychain triumphantly on her finger. She looked smug, the victor of a battle she didn't realize was a trap. She reached the driver's side door and pressed the unlock button on the fob. Nothing happened. She pressed it again, harder. Still nothing. I had engaged the deadlock from my phone the moment I went upstairs. The physical key fob was useless without the biometric scan of my thumbprint. Chloe let out a sound of frustration that I could hear even through the glass. She stomped around to the trunk. If she couldn't drive it, she was probably going to snoop, looking for these so-called sensitive files to mock me about later. She jammed her fingers under the trunk latch and pulled. It didn't budge. "Open, you piece of junk!" she screamed, kicking the rear bumper. She tried to pry the trunk open, digging her long, manicured nails into the seam between the trunk lid and the body of the car. It was a foolish move. The car was built like a tank. The gap was sealed tight. Suddenly, she shrieked. It wasn't a scream of anger this time. It was pain. She yanked her hand back, clutching her index finger. Even from the second floor, I could see the problem. Her acrylic nail, an elaborate piece of art she had probably spent hundreds of dollars on, had snapped backward, taking part of the real nail with it. In her flailing attempt to save her nail, the keys in her other hand scraped violently across the trunk, leaving a jagged white scar on the dark gray paint. I watched as she stared at the scratch, then at her bleeding finger. For a second, she looked terrified. She had damaged the car I had explicitly told her not to touch. But then the fear morphed instantly into victimhood. It was the family way. She ran back towards the house, wailing like a siren. I turned off the shower and walked calmly downstairs, timing my arrival to coincide with hers. I reached the bottom of the steps, just as Chloe burst through the front door, tears streaming down her face, holding her hand out like a war wound. "Mom! Marcus!" she screamed. "Look what her stupid car did to me!" Beatrice rushed forward, her face pale with worry. "Oh my God, my poor baby, what happened? I tried to open the trunk to get her stupid files out so I could use the space." Chloe sobbed, completely fabricating her intent. "And the lock is broken. It snapped shut on my hand. It is a death trap. Look at my nail. It is ruined." She turned to me, her eyes filled with venom. "You did this on purpose. You knew the lock was sticky. You wanted me to get hurt." I stood at the bottom of the stairs, my face impassive. I walked past them out the open front door and looked at the car. The scratch was deep, cutting through the clear coat. I looked back at Chloe, who was now being cradled by Beatrice while Marcus examined her finger with exaggerated concern. "You scratched the paint?" I said quietly. "Is that all you care about?" Beatrice shrieked, her face turning red. "Your sister is bleeding. She could have lost a finger. That car is dangerous. You are irresponsible for keeping such a piece of junk in this driveway." "It is a defect," Marcus declared, seizing the moral high ground. "I will have the legal department look into it. We could sue the manufacturer. But right now, Sophia, you need to apologize. You should have warned her." I looked at the three of them. The scratch on the car was unfortunate, but the files in the trunk were safe. The biometric lock had held. They hadn't seen the evidence. They hadn't seen the truth. They were too busy nursing a broken nail and a bruised ego to realize they had just tried to break into a vault. "I am sorry, Chloe," I said, my voice dripping with a cold, hollow sincerity. "I am sorry that you did not listen when I said no." I took the keys from the counter where she had dropped them and walked back upstairs. Let them comfort her. Let them blame the car. Let them think I was the villain of their evening. Tomorrow I would bring the car to the office. Tomorrow the files in that trunk would come out. And tomorrow a broken nail would be the least of their problems. The Monday morning atmosphere at Vanguard Holdings was always frantic, a chaotic symphony of ringing phones and clacking keyboards. But from my little desk in the corner, everything seemed to move in slow motion. I had spent the weekend nursing the secret of the Apex Global Supplies invoices, letting the anger simmer into a cold, hard resolve. My family thought I was sulking over a scratched car and a broken nail. They had no idea I was currently dissecting the financial anatomy of the company they depended on for their lavish lifestyles. I had the digital trail. I knew Brad was skimming money. But in the corporate world, a digital trail is only half the battle. You need a chain of command. You need to know who authorized the theft. I logged into the secure archive server using the backdoor access I had established. I pulled up the original purchase orders, the documents that legally authorized the transfer of millions of dollars to Brad's shell company. I needed to see the approval signature. I expected to see Brad's scrawl, or perhaps a forged authorization from the CFO. When the image loaded on my screen, my breath hitched in my throat. The signature at the bottom of the page, bold and flourishing with arrogant loops, was not Brad's. It was Marcus Vance, my father. I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking rhythmically like a heartbeat. A wave of nausea washed over me. Marcus was a lot of things. He was vain, he was cruel, he was dismissive, and he was a terrible father. But I never took him for a criminal. He was too obsessed with his reputation, too desperate to be respected by men like Arthur Sterling. Embezzlement was messy. It was risky. It didn't fit his psychological profile, unless he was more desperate for money than I knew, unless the debts were piling up so high that he had no choice but to steal from the hand that fed him. If Marcus was knowingly signing these orders, then my plan had to change. I couldn't just destroy Brad. I would have to take them both down. I would have to watch my own father be handcuffed and led out of the building. The thought brought a strange, bitter taste to my mouth. I hated how he treated me, but the idea of sending him to prison felt like a line I wasn't ready to cross. I needed to know the truth. Was he the mastermind or was he the fool? I closed the window on my screen as I saw Brad walking down the hallway. He was carrying a stack of colorful folders, whistling a tune that sounded irritatingly cheerful. He didn't look like a man worried about being caught. He looked like a man who had covered his tracks. He walked straight into Marcus's office, leaving the door slightly ajar. I grabbed a notepad and a pen standing up. I needed a reason to be near that door. I walked over to the filing cabinet that stood just outside Marcus's office, pretending to search for a document. From this angle, I could see them clearly through the gap in the door, and I could hear every word. Marcus was sitting behind his desk, leaning back in his leather chair, looking bored. He was scrolling through something on his tablet, probably checking stock prices or looking at golf clubs. Brad placed the stack of folders on the desk with a friendly thud. "Morning, Marcus," Brad said, his voice oozing with that fake charm he used so well. "Just a few things for you to sign before the compliance meeting. Standard stuff. Vendor renewals, safety protocols, the usual bureaucratic nonsense." Marcus sighed, a heavy dramatic sound. "Why do they generate so much paperwork, Brad? It is endless. Do they think I have nothing better to do than sign my name all day?" "I know it is ridiculous," Brad agreed, leaning over the desk. He opened the first folder. "This one is just the cleaning crew contract renewal. Sign here." Marcus didn't read it. He didn't even glance at the terms. He just grabbed his expensive fountain pen and signed his name with a quick, practiced motion. Brad flipped the page. "This is the catering request for the shareholder lunch. Sign here." Marcus signed again, complaining about the quality of the salmon at the last event. "And this," Brad said, his voice not changing in pitch or tempo, "is just the authorization for the construction material surplus. We need to lock in the prices before the quarter ends. Just a formality to keep the accounts balanced." I froze. That was it. That was the Apex Global invoice. I knew the document number. I knew the header. Marcus didn't pause. He didn't ask why there was a surplus. He didn't ask about the vendor. He was too busy looking at his watch, probably thinking about his lunch reservation. He signed the document authorizing a payment that was 3 times the market rate, effectively stealing from the company he claimed to love without even blinking. "Done," Marcus said, capping his pen. "Anything else?" "Just the safety inspection log," Brad said, flipping to the last page. "You are a lifesaver, Marcus. I do not know how this place would run without your oversight." Marcus preened under the flattery. He straightened his tie, looking pleased with himself. "Well, someone has to keep the ship steady, Brad. You are doing good work, son. Keep it up." Brad gathered the folders, a small, triumphant smile playing on his lips. He turned to leave, and I quickly buried my head in the filing cabinet, my heart pounding against my ribs. He didn't know. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. My father wasn't a criminal mastermind. He wasn't a conspirator. He was just lazy. He was an arrogant, negligent man who was so confident in his own importance that he couldn't be bothered to read what he was signing. He trusted Brad because Brad fed his ego. Brad was playing him like a fiddle, using Marcus's signature to shield himself from liability. If the fraud was discovered, it would be Marcus's name on the paper. It would be Marcus who went to jail. Brad would play the innocent subordinate who was just following orders from his director. I walked back to my desk, my legs feeling a little shaky. I sat down and looked at the empty screen. The anger that had been fueling me since the weekend began to shift. It didn't disappear, but it changed texture. It wasn't the hot, blinding rage of a victim anymore. It was something colder, something sadder. It was pity. I looked across the office at my father's glass walls. He was on the phone now, laughing loudly, probably boasting to a friend. He looked so powerful in his expensive suit in his corner office. But he was hollow. He was a puppet dancing on strings held by the man who was sleeping with his daughter and stealing his legacy. I couldn't send him to prison for stupidity. I could punish him for his cruelty. I could strip him of his unearned pride, but I couldn't let him take the fall for a crime he didn't even know he was committing. That wasn't justice. That was just tragedy. Brad, on the other hand, was a different story. He was a parasite. He was eating this family from the inside out, exploiting my sister's vanity and my father's arrogance. He was setting them up for a fall that would destroy them completely. My mission had just become significantly more complicated. I couldn't just expose the fraud because exposing the fraud meant exposing my father. I had to surgically remove the cancer without killing the patient. I had to corner Brad, force him to reveal himself, and exonerate my father before the authorities got involved. I cracked my knuckles and started typing. I needed to find a way to make Brad trip. I needed to create a situation where he had to act without Marcus's cover. I needed to isolate him. I opened the company calendar. There was an emergency budget meeting scheduled for Friday. Perfect. I would prepare a new report. Not the one Brad wanted me to copy, but a real one. One that highlighted the discrepancies without naming names, one that would force an audit. And I would make sure that when the questions started flying, Brad was the one standing in the spotlight, not Marcus. I looked at the scratched car keys sitting on my desk. "You wanted a war, Brad," I whispered to the empty air. "You thought you were fighting a sheep. You thought you were fighting a ghost. But you are fighting the owner of this building. And I am done playing nice." I picked up the phone and dialed the internal extension for the IT department. I needed access to Brad's emails. Not just the work ones, but the personal ones he accessed through the company network. If he was sloppy enough to steal using his own father-in-law's pen, he was sloppy enough to leave a trail of crumbs. It was time to go hunting. The objective had changed. Operation Revenge was over. Operation Rescue was just beginning, and Brad was going to be the sacrifice. The elevator ride down from the executive suite was usually the only time I could drop the mask. It was a suspended steel cage where I didn't have to be the meek, coffee-fetching sister-in-law or the terrified new hire. On this particular Tuesday, I was sharing the space with Arthur Henderson, the chief financial officer. He was a decent man, old school, the kind who actually cared about the numbers matching up, which was why Brad had been working so hard to keep him in the dark. We were discussing the volatility of the Asian markets. I hadn't intended to start the conversation, but he had muttered something about the yen under his breath, and before I could stop myself, I had responded with a comment on the central bank's interest rate adjustment. Now we were deep in a discussion about hedging strategies. For a moment, I forgot who I was supposed to be. I stood tall, my voice steady and authoritative, dissecting the fiscal report with the precision of the shark I used to be in New York. Henderson was nodding, looking at me not as an assistant but as a peer. He was listening to me with genuine respect. His brow furrowed in concentration as I explained why the current liquidity ratio was a ticking time bomb. Then the elevator chimed. The doors slid open on the 14th floor and Brad walked in. The atmosphere in the small box shifted instantly. It went from a boardroom to a crime scene. Brad stopped dead in his tracks, his hand hovering over the button panel. He looked at Henderson, then at me, and then back at Henderson. He had walked in on the tail end of my sentence, something about mitigating risk through diversified asset allocation. These were not words that belonged in the vocabulary of Sophia the charity case. These were words that belonged to his superiors. Brad blinked, his brain clearly struggling to process the image. "Sophia," he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "What are you doing?" "I sent you to get toner cartridges 20 minutes ago." I felt the shift immediately. I didn't flinch. I didn't apologize. I simply turned to him, keeping the same cool, professional demeanor I had held with the CFO. "The supply closet on 14 was locked, Brad," I said, dropping the "sir" for the first time. "Mr. Henderson was kind enough to offer me access to the executive supply room." It was a lie, of course, but it was a smooth one. However, Henderson didn't play along with the dismissal. He looked at Brad with a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. "Actually," Brad Henderson said, his voice gravelly, "your sister-in-law has some very interesting insights on the emerging market funds. You might want to listen to her more often. She seems to understand the current yield curve better than half your analysts." The silence that followed was deafening. Brad's face went through a complex series of gymnastics. Confusion morphed into shock, which then settled into a deep, gnawing suspicion. He looked at me. Really looked at me for the first time since I had arrived. He wasn't seeing the broken woman anymore. He was seeing a variable he hadn't accounted for. He forced a laugh, but it sounded like dry leaves being crushed. "Is that so?" Brad said, his eyes narrowing into slits. "I didn't know you read the Financial Times, Sophia. I thought you mostly read fashion magazines." "I read a lot of things," I replied, meeting his gaze evenly. The elevator reached the lobby. I stepped out first, not waiting for him to dismiss me. I could feel his eyes boring into my back as I walked away. I knew I had pushed it. I knew I had shown too much. But I also knew that fear was a powerful motivator, and I needed Brad to be afraid. I needed him to be looking over his shoulder, making mistakes. Back at my desk, I pulled up the internal surveillance feed. I had tapped into the camera in Brad's office days ago. He paced the room like a caged animal. He wasn't working, he was sweating. He kept looking at the door, then at his phone. The encounter in the elevator had rattled him more than I expected. To a man like Brad, competence in a woman he deemed inferior wasn't just surprising, it was threatening. It signaled that his control was an illusion. He sat down abruptly and made a call. I put on my headphones, tuning into the audio feed I had installed on his desktop. "It is me," Brad hissed into the receiver. "I need you to run a background check." "Deep dive." "Yes, I know, I already did a basic one. I want the real stuff." "The woman's name is Sophia Vance. She lived in New York for 5 years. She says she was unemployed recovering from a breakdown. I don't buy it. She knows things. She talks like she owns the place." He paused, listening to the person on the other end. "I don't care how much it costs," Brad snapped. "Just find out who she was working for. I think she might be a plant, a corporate spy. Or maybe she is working for the feds. Just get me something I can use to bury her." I took off the headphones and smiled. A private investigator. It was almost cute. He was trying to dig up dirt on a ghost. My time in New York was spent under layers of corporate anonymity. My assets were held in trusts, my name shielded by non-disclosure agreements and shell companies. The only thing a standard PI would find was a black hole. 2 days later, the report arrived. I saw it before Brad did. I intercepted the email attachment as it passed through the company server. I opened the PDF, curious to see what his money had bought him. It was a thin file. The investigator had hit a wall. The report stated that Sophia Vance had lived in Manhattan, but her employment history was sealed. It noted that she had no criminal record, no debt, and no social media footprint. But there was one detail the investigator had flagged. A blurred photo of me entering a high-end restaurant with a man who looked suspiciously like a senator. It was actually a business meeting regarding a zoning permit, but to the untrained eye, it looked intimate. The report concluded subject's financial means are unclear. Lived in a high-rent district with no visible income. Files are heavily redacted, typical of high-level government clearance or protected witness status. However, lack of tax records suggests off-the-books income. I forwarded the email to Brad's inbox, allowing him to see it. I switched back to the camera feed to watch his reaction. Brad opened the file. He read it quickly, his eyes darting back and forth. When he finished, he slammed his fist on the desk, but then a slow, greasy smile spread across his face. He leaned back in his chair, looking at the ceiling with an expression of pure, arrogant triumph. I could practically hear the gears turning in his small, dirty mind. He didn't see a successful businesswoman. He didn't see a hidden heir. He saw what he wanted to see. He saw a woman living in New York with no job and a lot of money. He saw redacted files. He saw the photo with the older man. "She is not a spy," Brad muttered to himself, loud enough for the microphone to catch. "She is a mistress." He laughed a disgusting, self-satisfied sound. "That is it. She was sleeping with someone powerful. That is how she knows the jargon. That is how she survived. And now she is here." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. "She is sleeping with Sterling," he whispered, the theory solidifying in his mind into absolute fact. "That is why the CEO bowed to her. That is why she got the job. She is Sterling's side piece." It was so absurd, I almost laughed out loud at my desk. The idea that I would need to sleep my way to the middle was insulting, but it was also perfect. Brad thought he had found my secret. He thought he had leverage. He believed that my power came from a man, specifically his boss. This meant he wouldn't look for the financial records I was gathering. He wouldn't look for the takeover documents. He would be too busy trying to expose a scandal that didn't exist. He thought I was a whore. I was going to show him that I was the executioner. Let him have his theory. Let him feel safe in his misogyny. It would only make the knife cut deeper when I finally twisted it. I closed the surveillance window and went back to work typing up the final summary of his embezzlement. The villain had his suspicion, and it was going to be his undoing. Wednesday afternoon arrived with a heavy, stifling atmosphere that usually signaled a storm was coming, but inside the air-conditioned glass box of Vanguard Holdings, the only turbulence was being manufactured by Brad. I sat at my desk, seemingly engrossed in formatting a spreadsheet, but my attention was entirely focused on the small window minimized in the corner of my screen. It was the live feed from the micro camera I had concealed on the bookshelf behind me. It gave me a perfect view of my own workspace from a vantage point no one else had, and right now it was showing me exactly what kind of man my brother-in-law truly was. I had stepped away from my desk for exactly 3 minutes to use the restroom. In that short window, Brad had made his move. On the screen, I watched him look left, then right, his movements jerky and paranoid. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick white envelope. I knew exactly what was inside. $5,000 in petty cash withdrawn earlier that morning for a supposed vendor bonus. He slid the envelope quickly into my open handbag, which was sitting on the floor beside my chair. He pushed it deep to the bottom beneath my makeup bag and wallet, ensuring it wouldn't be seen by a casual glance. Then he straightened up, smoothed his tie, and walked away with a smirk that made my skin crawl. He was trying to frame me. It was a crude, desperate tactic, the kind of thing a high school bully does not a corporate executive. He wanted to catch me with the stolen money, humiliate me in front of Marcus, and have me escorted out of the building by security before I could dig any deeper into his affairs. He thought he was being clever. He thought he was the hunter. I walked back to my desk, my heels clicking rhythmically on the linoleum. I sat down and picked up my bag. I could feel the extra weight of the envelope at the bottom. I didn't panic. I didn't gasp. I simply waited. I knew Brad's routine. In about 5 minutes, he would go to the break room to get his third espresso of the afternoon. He would leave his office door open because he was arrogant enough to believe no one would dare enter his sanctuary. The moment he rounded the corner toward the kitchen, I moved. I didn't run. I glided. I took my bag with me, walking calmly into his empty office. His leather briefcase was sitting on the visitor chair, the flap unbuckled. It was too easy. I reached into my bag, retrieved the thick white envelope, and slid it seamlessly into the main compartment of his briefcase, tucking it between his laptop and a stack of files. The entire transfer took less than 10 seconds. By the time I was back at my desk typing a sentence about quarterly projections, Brad was walking back down the hall blowing on his hot coffee, completely unaware that the bomb he had built was now ticking in his own lap. An hour later, the show began. Brad burst out of his office, his face a mask of manufactured outrage. He slammed his hand against the doorframe, causing the entire office to jump. "It is gone," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "The cash envelope for the vendor. It is gone." He marched toward Marcus's office, ensuring that every head in the department turned to watch. Marcus emerged, looking annoyed at the disturbance. "What is the matter with you, Brad?" Marcus asked, taking off his reading glasses. "Why are you shouting the $5,000, Brad said, pointing back at his desk. "I left it right there on the blotter. I went to get coffee and when I came back it was gone. We have a thief, Marcus. Right here in this office." The word thief hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Whispers started rippling through the cubicles. Brad turned slowly, his eyes locking onto me. It was a rehearsed performance and he was savoring every second of it. "I do not want to point fingers," Brad said, his voice dropping to a theatrical volume that was meant to be heard by everyone. "But we have had a lot of new faces lately. People whose backgrounds we do not really know. People who might be desperate for cash." Marcus followed his gaze. He looked at me, his expression softening into disappointment. He didn't want to believe it, but Brad was his son-in-law, his right-hand man. If Brad said it, it must be true. Sophia, Marcus said heavily. "Did you see anyone enter Brad's office?" "No, sir," I said, standing up. "I have been at my desk all afternoon." Brad scoffed. "Of course you have. Conveniently located right outside my door. Look, Marcus, we cannot take risks. That money is company property. I think we need to call security. We need to search personal belongings. If she has nothing to hide, she won't mind." "I do not mind," I said calmly. Brad blinked. He had expected me to cry, to protest, to make a scene. My compliance threw him off for a second, but he recovered quickly. He picked up the phone and dialed the security desk. 10 minutes later, 2 uniformed guards were standing in the bullpen. The tension was palpable. Everyone had stopped working. They were watching the fall of the new girl, waiting for the scandal that would be the talk of the water cooler for months. "Check her bag first," Brad commanded, pointing a finger at me. She was the only one close enough to take it. The lead guard, a man named Miller, who I happened to know, had a sick daughter whose medical bills were quietly being paid by an anonymous donor, looked at me apologetically. "I am sorry," Miss Miller said. "I have to check." "Go ahead," I said, handing him my tote bag. Brad crossed his arms, a smug grin plastered on his face. He was practically vibrating with anticipation. He was waiting for the moment Miller would pull out the white envelope. He was probably already drafting the termination letter in his head. Miller placed my bag on the desk. He took out my wallet. He took out my makeup case. He took out a notebook. He felt around the lining, checking for hidden pockets. He turned the bag upside down and shook it. A few mints and a pen fell out. Nothing else. The silence in the room changed frequency. It went from anticipatory to confused. Brad's grin faltered. He took a step forward. "Check again," he snapped. "Look in the side pockets." "It is there. I know it is there." Miller checked again. Thoroughly. He looked up at Brad. "It is empty, sir. Just personal items." Brad's face turned a mottled shade of red. "That is impossible," he stammered. I mean, it has to be her. She must have hidden it on her person. Search her coat." Marcus stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "That is enough, Brad. You are making a scene. If it is not in her bag, it is not in her bag. We are not strip-searching my daughter in the middle of the office." "But the money," Brad yelled, losing his composure. $5,000 does not just vanish." "Marcus?" I cleared my throat. The sound was soft, but in the silence it sounded like a gavel striking a sounding block. "Maybe you misplaced it, Brad," I suggested gently. "You have been very stressed lately. Perhaps you put it somewhere for safekeeping and forgot." "I did not forget," Brad shouted, turning on me with wild eyes. "I am not senile. I left it on the desk. Maybe you put it in your briefcase, I asked, pointing to the leather bag he was clutching in his left hand. You usually keep important documents in there. Brad looked at the briefcase as if it were a foreign object. Don't be ridiculous. I never put cash in here. Why don't you just check? Marcus said, his voice sharp with irritation. Just to be sure, Brad, before we call the police and file a report. Brad let out a frustrated huff. Fine, fine. I will show you. It is not there, and then we are checking the trash cans. He slammed the briefcase onto my desk right next to my empty bag. He unbuckled the flap with aggressive, jerky movements. He grabbed the handle and upended the bag, shaking it violently to prove his point. His laptop slid out, a few pens clattered onto the desk, and then sliding gracefully out from between two manila folders came the thick white envelope. It hit the desk with a heavy, unmistakable thud. The room went completely still. Everyone stared at the envelope. It was right there, center stage, undeniably present. Brad froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at the envelope, then at me, then at Marcus. His eyes were wide with a mixture of horror and confusion. He couldn't understand how it had happened. He knew he had put it in my bag. He was certain of it. His reality was fracturing right in front of him. Marcus reached out and picked up the envelope. He opened it and thumbed through the bills. It is all here, Marcus said, his voice dripping with icy disapproval. He looked at Brad with a gaze that withered the younger man where he stood. You accused this girl of theft. You wasted security's time. You disrupted the entire department. And it was in your own bag the whole time. Brad was sweating profusely now. He tugged at his collar, his eyes darting around the room looking for an escape. I, he stammered. I must have… yes. I remember now. I put it there when I went to the bathroom. For safety. With the stress of the merger, I completely forgot. He forced a laugh, but it sounded like a dying animal. Silly me, right? Just a lapse in memory. Good thing we found it. No harm done. Marcus stared at him for a long moment, not smiling. You are the director of operations, Brad Marcus said quietly. You are supposed to be organized. This is embarrassing. Apologize to Sophia. Brad turned to me. His face was a mask of pure hatred, barely concealed by a thin veneer of civility. He knew I had done it. He didn't know how, but he knew. And the fact that he couldn't prove it terrified him. I am sorry, Sophia. He grated out through clenched teeth. My mistake. It is okay, Brad, I said, smiling sweetly. We all have days where we lose track of things. Maybe you should take the afternoon off. You look like you are about to crack. Brad snatched his briefcase and the envelope, turning on his heel and retreating into his office like a wounded dog. He slammed the door, but the damage was done. The whispers that started up again weren't about me. They were about him, about his incompetence, about his erratic behavior. I thanked Miller and sat back down. I pulled up the camera feed again. Brad was sitting at his desk, head in his hands, staring at the wall. He wasn't just afraid anymore. He was paranoid. He knew he was playing a game against an opponent he couldn't see, and for the first time in his life, he was realizing that he might actually lose. The trap had sprung, and while he had chewed his leg off to escape, he was now limping. And a limping prey is the easiest kind to catch. The champagne cork popped with a sound that felt violently cheerful, echoing off the high ceilings of the family dining room like a gunshot. It was Friday night, and the air was thick with the scent of roast beef and expensive perfume. Chloe stood at the head of the table, her face flushed with the kind of radiance that usually comes from a combination of adrenaline and being the absolute center of attention. She held her glass of sparkling cider aloft, her other hand resting theatrically on her completely flat stomach. The announcement had just landed, and the shockwave was still rippling through the room. She was pregnant. The golden child was reproducing. Beatrice was the first to react, letting out a shriek of delight that was so high-pitched it made the crystal glasses vibrate. She rushed from her chair, knocking over a napkin holder in her haste to embrace her youngest daughter. Tears were already streaming down her face. Tears that I knew she could summon on command. "Oh, my baby," she wailed, clutching Chloe as if she had just returned from war, rather than simply announcing a biological function. "You are going to be a mother. I am going to be a grandmother. This is the happiest day of my life." Marcus sat back in his chair, a broad, satisfied grin stretching across his face. He looked at Brad, nodding with a deep, masculine approval. "Good work, son," he boomed, raising his scotch glass. "That is what it is all about. Legacy. Building the next generation. A Vance heir." I sat silently at the far end of the table, nursing a glass of water. I watched the scene unfold with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a colony of ants. They were so happy. They were so oblivious. They were celebrating the expansion of a dynasty that was currently crumbling beneath their feet. Chloe was beaming, soaking up the adoration, looking at Brad with eyes that saw a provider, a protector, a successful executive. She didn't see the man who had tried to frame her sister for theft just 3 days ago. She didn't see the man who was embezzling from her father's company. The celebration quickly pivoted, as it always did in this house, from emotional joy to financial demands. Beatrice pulled away from Chloe, wiping her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and turned her gaze toward me. The warmth instantly evaporated from her face, replaced by that familiar calculating look she reserved for her disappointment of a daughter. "Well," Sophia Beatrice said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the joyous atmosphere, "do you have nothing to say? Your sister just gave you the best news imaginable, and you are sitting there like a stone. Are you so consumed by jealousy that you cannot even offer a congratulation?" I put down my glass. "I am very happy for you, Chloe," I said, my voice steady. "A baby is a blessing." Beatrice huffed, clearly unsatisfied with my performance. "Words are cheap, Sophia. We need action. This baby deserves the best. We need to start planning the nursery immediately. We need the imported crib from Italy, the one Chloe showed me in the magazine. We need to repaint the guest room, put in new carpet, get a nanny lined up." She paused, her eyes narrowing as she mentally calculated the costs. Then she smiled, a cold, thin expression. "Since you are living here rent-free, Sophia, and since you have been saving your little salary from the city, I think it is only fair that you cover the nursery costs. It is your contribution to the family. Consider it a thank you for us not kicking you out on the street." I looked at her, then at Chloe, who was nodding in agreement, as if this was the most logical suggestion in the world. They thought I had a few $1,000s tucked away in a savings account, money I had scraped together from my mystery years in New York. They wanted to drain me dry, not because they needed the money, but because they needed to remind me of my place. They needed to ensure I remained dependent, broke, and subservient. "I am afraid I cannot do that, Mother," I said calmly. The room went silent. The joy evaporated. Beatrice's face turned a mottled shade of red. "Excuse me," she hissed. "Did you just say no to your pregnant sister?" "I did," I replied, picking up my fork and pushing a pea around my plate. Buying furniture and renovating a house is the responsibility of the parents. Brad has a very good job. I am sure he wants to provide for his own child without relying on his sister-in-law's charity. I looked at Brad. He was sitting up straighter now, his chest puffed out. The mention of his ability to provide had triggered his fragile ego exactly as I intended. He couldn't let me imply that he needed help. He couldn't let Marcus think he wasn't the big man on campus. Brad laughed, a loud, arrogant sound that grated on my nerves. He took a swig of his wine and slammed the glass down on the table. "She is right, Beatrice," Brad declared, looking at me with a sneer. "We do not need her pennies. Keep your little savings, Sophia. Buy yourself some better clothes. You look like a librarian." He turned to Chloe, grabbing her hand and kissing it ostentatiously. "I have big news of my own, actually. I was saving it for dessert, but now is as good a time as any." He looked around the table, ensuring he had everyone's undivided attention. Marcus and I discussed it this morning. With the merger coming up and the current VP retiring next month, I am the top candidate for the Vice President of Operations role. It is practically a done deal. The salary bump is massive. The bonuses alone will be more than Sophia makes in 10 years. Chloe squealed, clapping her hands. "Oh my God, Brad, Vice President! That is amazing!" Marcus nodded sagely. "It is a big responsibility, Brad, but you have earned it. You have shown initiative." Brad leaned back, crossing his arms behind his head, basking in the glory. "Exactly. So do not worry about the crib, Beatrice. I will buy the crib. In fact, once the promotion goes through next month, I am thinking of making an offer on this house. I will buy the whole thing. Marcus can retire in style, and we will keep it in the family. We will renovate the whole place." He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with malice. "And then, Sophia, we will see if we still have a room for you in the servants' quarters. Or maybe the basement." The table erupted in laughter. Beatrice looked at him with adoration. Marcus looked proud. Chloe looked like she had just won the lottery. They were planning their future, a future built on stolen money and delusions of grandeur. I waited for the laughter to die down. I waited until the silence returned, filled only by the clinking of silverware. Then I smiled. It wasn't my usual polite, submissive smile. It was a genuine smile, one that reached my eyes, though none of them noticed the danger in it. "Congratulations, Brad," I said softly. "Vice President. That is a very serious position." "Thank you," Sophia Brad said, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. "Try not to be too bitter." "I am not bitter." I continued, my voice taking on a thoughtful, almost helpful tone. "I am just thinking about the process. For a C-suite promotion like that, especially in a public company like Vanguard, the vetting process is incredibly thorough." Brad paused his fork halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean?" "Well," I said, leaning forward slightly, resting my chin on my hand. "When I was reading about corporate structures, I learned that before a board approves a VP appointment, they mandate a full external audit of the candidate's department. They call it due diligence. They have to make sure there are no liabilities. They check every invoice, every vendor contract, every signature from the last 5 years, just to protect the shareholders." I saw the color drain from Brad's face. It happened slowly, then, all at once, like a curtain falling. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed look of pure terror. "They check everything," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Oh yes," I said cheerfully. "Everything, especially the procurement logs and the vendor supply chains. They bring in forensic accountants. It is standard procedure. But you have nothing to worry about, right? You are so organized. I am sure the audit will be a breeze." I picked up my wine glass and raised it in a mock toast. "To the audit," I said. "And to your promotion. I hope the due diligence goes smoothly." Marcus and Beatrice raised their glasses, oblivious to the context. To the promotion, they chorused. But Brad didn't raise his glass. He sat frozen, staring at me with eyes that were screaming. He knew. In that moment, he finally understood. He realized that the promotion he was bragging about was actually a trap. The higher he climbed, the harder the fall would be. The very mechanism that was supposed to crown him king was the one that was going to expose his crimes. He looked down at his plate, his hands trembling slightly. He suddenly looked very small, very young, and very, very guilty. I took a sip of my water, the cool liquid soothing my throat. The nursery talk started up again, Beatrice babbling about color schemes, but Brad was silent. He was mentally replaying every fake invoice, every forged signature, every dollar he had stolen. He was realizing that he had just announced his own execution date. And the best part was, he couldn't back out. He couldn't refuse the promotion without raising suspicion. He was stuck on a train that was hurtling toward a cliff, and I was the one who had greased the tracks. Dinner tasted delicious tonight. The notification pinged on Brad's computer screen at exactly 9 in the morning. a cheerful little sound that heralded the end of his world. I was sitting at my desk just outside his office, wearing my headphones but listening to nothing, my eyes fixed on the reflection in the glass partition. I watched him click the mouse. I saw his body stiffen. It was an email from the external auditing firm, a subsidiary of Onyx Capital, the mysterious investment group that had recently acquired the company's debt. The subject line was innocuous enough, pre-merger compliance review, but the contents were a death sentence. The email stated in polite but unyielding corporate language that a team of forensic accountants would be arriving on Monday to conduct a comprehensive audit of all procurement channels and vendor contracts from the last fiscal year. It explicitly mentioned a zero-tolerance policy for discrepancies and a requirement for original physical signatures on all invoices over $5,000. I saw the color drain from Brad's face. He looked like a man who had just been told he had 24 hours to live. He loosened his tie, his hands shaking so badly he knocked over his coffee cup. The dark liquid spread across his desk, soaking into the papers, but he didn't even move to clean it up. He just stared at the screen, reading the words over and over again, hoping they would change. Forensic accountants. That meant they wouldn't just look at the spreadsheets. They would call the vendors. They would check the tax IDs. They would visit the physical addresses. They would find the P.O. box for Apex Global Supplies, and they would find the paper trail leading right back to Brad's personal bank account. He spent the rest of the day in a state of manic paralysis. He made phone calls that ended in hushed shouting. He shredded documents, unaware that I had already digitized everything weeks ago. He paced his office like a caged tiger, his eyes wild and bloodshot. By the time 5 o'clock rolled around, he looked 10 years older. He grabbed his briefcase and stormed out of the office without saying a word to anyone. I waited 5 minutes, then packed my bag and followed him. I knew exactly where he was going. He was running out of options, and when a parasite runs out of options, it tries to find a new host to infect. He didn't go home to Chloe. He went to my parents' estate. I parked my car down the street, hidden by the shadows of the old oak trees, and walked up the driveway on foot. The night was overcast, a light drizzle beginning to fall, turning the cobblestones slick and dark. I let myself in through the side entrance, using the key I had never returned, moving silently through the kitchen and into the hallway. I could hear voices coming from the study. The door was slightly ajar, casting a slice of yellow light across the dark floorboards. I approached quietly, pressing my back against the wall, listening. "You have to sign it, Marcus." Brad's voice was desperate, shrill, lacking all of its usual smooth charm. "It is just a formality, a backdated authorization. It just says that you personally approved the Apex contracts due to a supply shortage. It protects the department." I risked a glance through the crack in the door. The scene inside broke my heart in a way I hadn't expected. My father, the great Marcus Vance, the man who had terrified me as a child, was sitting in his leather armchair looking small and frail. He was wearing his pajamas and a dressing gown, holding a glass of whiskey with a trembling hand. Brad was standing over him, looming, thrusting a document into his face. "I don't understand," Marcus said, his voice slurring slightly. "Why do I need to sign this now?" "It is midnight, Brad. And why is it dated 6 months ago? I don't remember approving this vendor." "Because you forgot," Brad shouted, slamming his hand on the desk. "You forget things all the time, Marcus. You are getting old. You told me to handle it, and I did. But now the auditors are coming, and if this paper isn't in the file, they are going to think I acted without authority. Do you want me to get fired?" "Is that what you want?" Marcus blinked, confused. "No, of course not. But this looks like an admission of liability, Brad. If the prices are wrong and I sign this, it means I am the one who authorized the waste. It puts the blame on me." Brad dropped to his knees in front of the chair, changing tactics. He grabbed Marcus's hands, his face twisting into a mask of pathetic pleading. "Dad, please, listen to me. It is not about blame. It is about hierarchy. If they blame me, I get fired immediately. I lose the promotion. I lose my pension. I lose everything. But you are Marcus Vance. You are a legend here. If they think it was your decision, they will just call it a strategic error. They won't fire you. You are retiring soon anyway. It won't matter to you. He squeezed Marcus's hands tighter. Think about Chloe. Think about the baby. She is pregnant, Marcus. Do you want your grandchild to be born into poverty? Do you want Chloe to lose her house? If I lose this job, we are on the street. Is that what you want for your favorite daughter? To see her destitute because you were too stubborn to sign a piece of paper, it was a masterful, disgusting manipulation. He was weaponizing Marcus's love for Chloe, using the unborn child as a shield for his own crimes. He knew Marcus would do anything for the golden child. He knew that was his weak point. Marcus looked down at the document, his eyes watering. He looked at the pen Brad was forcing into his hand. I could see the conflict raging inside him. He knew something was wrong. His instincts, dulled by years of comfort, were screaming at him that this was a trap. But the fear of failing Chloe, the fear of being the reason his family suffered, was stronger. I cannot let Chloe suffer, Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. She needs to be taken care of. Exactly. Brad urged, his eyes lighting up with predatory hope. She needs you to be a hero, Dad. Just sign it. Save us. Save the family. Marcus took a deep breath, his hand shaking violently. He uncapped the pen. He lowered the tip to the paper. Brad watched him holding his breath, practically salivating at the prospect of his own salvation. He was about to transfer his entire prison sentence onto the shoulders of an old man who just wanted to protect his daughter. I couldn't watch anymore. The pity I felt for my father was overshadowed by a burning, righteous anger. I stepped away from the wall and pushed the door open. It swung inward with a heavy creak that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Don't sign it, Dad. My voice was calm, steady, and cold as ice. Brad spun around, nearly losing his balance. Marcus looked up, the pen freezing millimeters from the paper. They both stared at me as if I were a ghost. I stood in the doorway, the hallway darkness framing me, my wet hair plastered to my face, my eyes locking onto Brad with a promise of destruction. Sophia. Marcus breathed, confusion clouding his eyes. What are you doing here? Get out! Brad screamed, panic making his voice crack. This is a private conversation. You have no right to be here. I ignored him. I walked into the room, my gaze never leaving my father. I walked until I was standing right between them, effectively cutting the cord of manipulation Brad had established. Put the pen down, Dad, I said gently. He is lying to you. Lying? Marcus looked at the paper, then at me. What do you mean? He is not asking you to sign a compliance form, I explained, keeping my voice soft but firm. He is asking you to sign a confession. He has been embezzling money from the company for 2 years. He set up a shell company called Apex Global. He has been buying materials at triple the cost and pocketing the difference. Liar. Brad shrieked, lunging toward me. I stepped back smoothly and he stumbled, catching himself on the desk. She is crazy, Marcus. She is jealous. She is trying to ruin me. I pulled a folded piece of paper from my pocket. It was the invoice I had copied, the one with the real market values highlighted in red next to the prices Brad had charged. I placed it on the desk over the document Brad wanted signed. Look at the numbers, Dad, I said. Look at them. That is why the auditors are coming. They know the money is missing. Brad knows he is caught. If you sign that paper, you are telling the world that you stole that money. You will go to prison, not for a strategic error, for fraud. Marcus looked at the paper. He looked at the numbers. He was a businessman despite his faults. He knew how to read a balance sheet. The realization hit him slowly, turning his face a pale, sickly gray. He looked up at Brad, his eyes wide with horror and betrayal. You stole from us, Marcus whispered. And you want me to go to jail for it? Brad was backing away now, his face twisting into an ugly snarl. He realized the game was up. The charm was gone. The mask was off. So what if I did? Brad spat, his voice dripping with venom. You old fool, you barely look at the books. You made it so easy. And why shouldn't I take a cut? I run this place while you play golf. I deserve it. I stepped closer to him, standing my ground. You deserve a cell, Brad. And you are going to get one. You think you can stop me? Brad laughed, a frantic, unhinged sound. You are a nobody, Sophia. A secretary. Who is going to believe you over me? I will tell them you forged this. I will tell them you are insane. I didn't shout. I didn't get angry. I just looked at him with a profound, terrifying calmness. They will believe me, Brad, because I am not just the secretary. I am the one who hired the auditors. The silence that followed was absolute. Brad stared at me, his brain trying to process the information, trying to square the circle of the woman he had bullied with the power I was claiming. I took the pen from my father's shaking hand and capped it with a decisive click. Go home to your pregnant wife, Brad. Enjoy your last night of freedom, because tomorrow morning the real owner of this company walks through the front door, and she is not forgiving anyone. The sound of the paper tearing was the loudest thing in the room, a sharp, violent ripping noise that seemed to echo off the mahogany walls of my father's study. I held the pieces of the backdated confession in my hands, shredding them once, twice, 3 times, until the document that would have sent my father to prison was nothing more than white confetti raining down onto the Persian rug. I looked at Brad through the falling paper snow. His face had gone from pale terror to a deep, congested purple. The vein in his forehead was throbbing so hard I thought it might burst. He had been so close. He had the pen in Marcus's hand. He had his escape route mapped out. And I had just destroyed it right in front of his eyes. You little bitch! Brad screamed, the sound tearing from his throat like a wild animal. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. He just snapped. He lunged across the space between us, his hands curled into claws, aiming for my throat. In his mind, I was still Sophia, the weakling, Sophia, the victim, the woman who could be bullied into submission. He had forgotten that while he was busy stealing money and playing golf, I had spent the last 5 years channeling my rage into survival. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. As his heavy frame came crashing toward me, time seemed to slow down. I saw the desperation in his eyes, the sloppy, amateurish way he threw his weight forward. I stepped slightly to the left, a movement so subtle he didn't even register it until it was too late. As his arm passed my shoulder, I reached out and clamped my hand around his wrist. My grip was iron. I used his own momentum against him, pivoting on my heel and twisting his arm behind his back in a seamless, fluid motion that I had practiced thousands of times in the Krav Maga studio in Tel Aviv. Brad let out a howl of pain as his shoulder joint was pushed to its limit. I didn't let go. I drove my knee into the back of his thigh, buckling his leg, and shoved him hard. He flew forward, colliding face first with the heavy oak bookshelf. Books and framed photos clattered to the floor around him. He tried to turn to fight back, but I was already there. I pressed my forearm against the back of his neck, pinning him against the wood, immobilizing him completely. He gasped for air, his cheek pressed against the spine of a leather-bound encyclopedia. He was helpless. The man who had terrorized this family, who had looked down on me with such arrogance, was now trembling beneath my touch. Listen to me very closely, Brad, I whispered, leaning down so my lips were inches from his ear. My voice was low, devoid of emotion, a cold contrast to his frantic panting. If you ever try to touch me again, if you ever try to threaten my father again, I will break your arm. Do you understand me? He grunted, unable to speak. The fight completely drained out of him by the shock of my physical dominance. I pulled back and shoved him one last time, sending him stumbling toward the center of the room. He clutched his shoulders, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. He looked like a child who had just realized the monster under the bed was real. Get out of my house, I said, my voice ringing clear and authoritative. And Brad, when you wake up tomorrow morning, do not bother coming to the office to save your job. Use that time to find a very expensive criminal defense lawyer. You are going to need one. Before Brad could respond, the study door flew open with a bang. The noise of the struggle had traveled. Beatrice stood in the doorway, clutching her silk robe tight around her throat, her hair in curlers. Chloe was right behind her, looking sleepy and confused, rubbing her pregnant belly. They took in the scene in a split second, but through the distorted lens of their own bias. They saw Brad, the golden boy, leaning against the desk, clutching his injured arm, breathing heavily. They saw the books on the floor. And they saw me standing tall, fists still clenched, looking dangerous. "Oh my God!" Chloe screamed, rushing into the room. "Brad, are you okay?" She threw her arms around him, looking at me with pure hatred. "Mom, she attacked him. Look at him. She hurt him." Beatrice's face contorted into a mask of fury. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't look at Marcus, who was still sitting in his chair, pale and shaking, holding the pen like a lifeline. She only saw her son-in-law in pain and her scapegoat daughter standing over him. "You animal!" Beatrice shrieked, marching toward me. Her hand raised as if to slap me, but she stopped when she saw the look in my eyes. She lowered her hand, trembling with rage. "How dare you! How dare you put your hands on him? In this house, have you lost your mind?" "He was forcing Dad to sign a confession," I said calmly, pointing to the torn paper on the floor. "He is stealing from us, Mother." "I was stopping him." "Liar!" Brad shouted from the safety of Chloe's embrace. He found his voice now that he had an audience. "She is lying." "Beatrice. She came in here like a lunatic. I was just helping Marcus with some paperwork, and she jumped me. She threatened to kill me. She is jealous of the baby. She is jealous of the promotion." Chloe began to sob, loud theatrical tears. "You are a monster, Sophia. You want to ruin my family. You want my baby to grow up without a father. You are just a bitter, violent, jealous old maid." I looked at my father. "Dad, tell them," I said. "Tell them what he was making you sign." Marcus looked up. He looked at me, then at Brad, then at his weeping wife and daughter. I saw the struggle in his eyes. I saw the truth sitting on the tip of his tongue. But then he looked at Chloe's stomach. He looked at the tears streaming down her face. He was a weak man. He had always been a weak man. He couldn't destroy his daughter's happiness even if it was built on a lie. He looked down at his lap and said nothing. His silence was the final nail in the coffin. "Get out!" Beatrice hissed, her voice low and shaking. "Get out of my house immediately. I am trying to save you," I said, feeling a strange sense of detachment. "I don't want your saving." Beatrice screamed, pointing at the door. "I want you gone. You are violent. You are dangerous. I do not know who you are anymore. You are not my daughter. You are a home wrecker. Pack your things and leave. Tonight. Right now. If you are not gone in 10 minutes, I am calling the police and having you arrested for assault." I looked at them one last time. The tableau of a perfect dysfunctional family. The crying pregnant sister, the indignant mother, the cowardly father, and the triumphant villain hiding behind their skirts. I realized then that I wasn't losing anything. I wasn't being exiled. I was being released. "I don't need 10 minutes," I said quietly. "I don't have anything in this house that I want to keep." I turned my back on them. I didn't look at Brad, though I could feel his gaze burning into my back, a mix of relief and gloating. He thought he had won. He thought that by getting me kicked out, he had silenced the threat. He didn't realize that he had just removed the only person in the world who had been willing to show him mercy. I walked out of the study, down the long hallway lined with portraits of a family I no longer belonged to. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the night. The rain was falling harder now, cold and sharp against my skin. I didn't have a coat. I didn't have my car keys. I had left them on the table. I walked down the driveway, the water soaking through my clothes, chilling me to the bone. But as I reached the iron gates of the estate, I didn't feel cold. I felt a fire burning in my chest. I pulled my phone from my pocket. It was waterproof, thankfully. I dialed a number I had memorized weeks ago. "This is Sophia Vance," I said into the phone as the rain matted my hair to my forehead. "I am authorizing the accelerated timeline for the takeover. Yes, immediately. And tell the security team to meet me at the Vanguard headquarters at 7 a.m. sharp. I want the locks changed before the employees arrive." I hung up and looked back at the house. The lights were still on in the study. They were probably comforting Brad, giving him ice for his shoulder, telling him how brave he was. Let them have their night. Let them have their delusion. Because when the sun came up, the house of cards they were living in was going to come crashing down, and I was going to be the one holding the sledgehammer. I started walking into the dark, a smile playing on my lips. The assistant was dead. The CEO was awake. The view from the 45th floor was breathtaking, a sprawling tapestry of city lights that looked like scattered diamonds on black velvet. For the past week, this penthouse had been my sanctuary, a fortress of glass and steel that felt a world away from the suffocating guest room at my parents' estate. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, swirling a glass of vintage Pinot Noir, watching the tiny cars move through the arteries of the city below. Somewhere down there in the chaotic grid of traffic, my family was preparing for what they believed would be the greatest night of their lives. They had no idea that the woman watching them from the clouds, the woman they thought was crying in a cheap motel room, was actually the one pulling the strings. My phone buzzed on the marble kitchen island. It was a message from the head of my security team. The venue is secure. The guests are arriving. The stage is set. Ms. Vance. I smiled, a cold, sharp expression that reflected in the dark glass. For 7 days, I had been a ghost. I had not answered their calls. I had not returned to the office. I had let silence do the heavy lifting. Silence is a terrifying thing to a guilty conscience, but to an arrogant mind, it looks like victory. Brad likely believed that I had run away, scared off by his threats and my mother's rejection. He probably thought he had won. Across town, the scene was playing out exactly as I had predicted. I could envision it perfectly, as if I were a fly on the wall of the high-end boutique where Beatrice and Chloe were currently fussing over their reflections. They had spent the last of their liquid cash renting gowns that cost more than most people made in a month. They wanted to look like royalty. They wanted to look like the ruling class of the new empire they believed Brad was about to inherit. In the dressing room, Chloe was likely struggling to zip up an emerald green sequined gown, her baby bump just barely visible. She would be preening, turning side to side, imagining the envy of the other wives and girlfriends. "Look at us, Mom," she would say, smoothing the fabric over her hips. "We are going to be the stars of the night." Brad said the new owners are very traditional. They respect legacy. That is why they invited us. Beatrice would be nodding, adjusting a diamond necklace that was almost certainly paste-rented along with the dress. "Of course they invited us, darling. We are the Vances. Your father built that company. Brad is saving it. We deserve to be there. And thank goodness that miserable sister of yours won't be there to ruin the aesthetic." Can you imagine her showing up in one of her gray rags? They had received the invitations 3 days ago. Heavy cream-colored cardstock with gold leaf lettering, hand-delivered by a courier. The invitation requested the pleasure of the Vance family at the Vanguard merger gala. It was vague, formal, and intoxicatingly validating. To them, it wasn't just an invite, it was a coronation. They interpreted the lack of Sophia on the invitation not as an omission, but as a confirmation that I had been erased from the narrative. Brad, meanwhile, would be pacing in his bedroom, fighting a war with his own nerves. He had spent the week sweating, waiting for the police to knock on his door. But no one came. The audit had started, but the forensic accountants had been strangely quiet, collecting files and saying nothing. Brad had convinced himself that the silence meant he was in the clear. He had convinced himself that Marcus in his cowardice had covered for him. He had convinced himself that my threat in the study was just the desperate barking of a cornered dog. "I can handle this," he would be muttering to himself as he tied his bow tie. "I am the VP. They need me. Sophia is gone. She is nobody." He was right about one thing. Sophia the assistant was gone. Tonight they would meet Sophia the CEO. I walked into my dressing room, passing the rows of designer suits and shoes that I had kept hidden in storage for 5 years. I stopped in front of the dress I had chosen for tonight. It wasn't gray. It wasn't modest. It was a floor-length gown of midnight blue silk, structured and sharp, with a neckline that commanded attention and a slit that suggested danger. It was a power suit disguised as evening wear. I slipped it on the cool fabric, settling against my skin like armor. I fastened a pair of sapphire earrings, the only jewelry I wore, and pulled my hair back into a severe, elegant bun. I looked in the mirror. The woman staring back was unrecognizable from the meek creature who had fetched coffee and taken verbal abuse for weeks. This woman looked like she could buy and sell the world. This woman looked like retribution. My driver texted that the car was waiting. I grabbed my clutch, which contained nothing but a single USB drive and a tube of red lipstick, and headed to the private elevator. As my car glided through the city streets heading toward the Grand Hotel, where the gala was being held, I checked the surveillance feed on my phone one last time. The Vance family had just arrived. I watched them step out of a stretch limousine, a rental that screamed new money. Flashbulbs popped. Chloe waved at the photographers basking in the attention. Beatrice held her head high, looking down her nose at the valet. Marcus looked pale, his smile forced his eyes darting around nervously. He was the only one who sensed the guillotine hanging above their heads, but he was too weak to warn them. And then there was Brad. He stepped out last, buttoning his jacket, puffing out his chest. He looked smug. He looked victorious. He offered his arm to Chloe and led his family up the red carpet, walking straight into the lion's den. I instructed my driver to take the back entrance. I wouldn't walk the red carpet. I didn't need the press to see me yet. I wanted to be on stage when they finally saw me. I wanted to see their faces when the curtain rose. I entered the venue through the kitchen, flanked by my security team. The staff stopped what they were doing and bowed their heads respectfully. "Good evening, Ms. Vance," the head of catering whispered. I nodded and made my way to the private viewing box that overlooked the ballroom. From here, I could see everything. I saw the crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the hundreds of guests. I saw the champagne flowing. And I saw my family standing near the center of the room holding court. They were laughing, clinking glasses with board members who were politely tolerating them. They looked so happy. They looked so safe. I checked my watch. 5 minutes until the announcement. 5 minutes until the fantasy ended. I applied the red lipstick, blotting it carefully. "Enjoy the champagne, Brad." I whispered to the glass partitions separating me from the noise of the party. "It is the last thing you will ever taste that you didn't pay for with your freedom." I turned to my head of security. "Tell the lighting crew to get ready, and tell the DJ to cut the music on my signal. It is time to introduce the new management." I walked toward the stage entrance, the click of my heels on the floor sounding like the ticking of a clock counting down to 0. The preparation was over. The execution was about to begin. The ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel was a masterpiece of opulence, a cavern of gold leaf and crystal that smelled of expensive champagne and old money. The air was cool and crisp, vibrating with the low hum of a string quartet playing in the corner, but to the Vance family, it felt like a stage built specifically for their triumph. They swept through the double doors with the confidence of royalty returning from exile. Beatrice led the charge, her chin held so high it looked painful, her eyes scanning the room, not to find friends, but to count the people who were looking at her. She adjusted the rented diamond necklace at her throat, a nervous tick she tried to disguise as elegance, and whispered to Chloe to stand up straight because everyone was watching. Chloe was indeed the center of attention, or at least she believed she was. She had her phone out the screen, glowing with the interface of a live stream, broadcasting her arrival to her followers. "Hey guys, we just arrived at the merger gala," she cooed into the camera, turning to capture the glittering chandeliers. "It is so exclusive. Brad is basically the guest of honor tonight. We are just so blessed." She panned the camera to Brad, who straightened his tie and gave a practiced winning smile that didn't quite reach his panicked eyes. Brad was trying to maintain the facade, but beneath the starch of his shirt, he was sweating. He scanned the room desperately, looking for validation. He spotted Arthur Sterling standing near the bar with a group of board members. This was his chance. He needed to be seen with the CEO. He needed to solidify his position before the mysterious new owners arrived. He patted Chloe on the hand, told her to keep filming, and strutted toward the group. "Mr. Sterling Brad called out, his voice a little too loud for the polite atmosphere. "Arthur, great to see you. What a night, right?" He extended his hand ready for the warm clasp of brotherhood. But Sterling didn't turn. He didn't smile. He simply shifted his stance, turning his back to Brad as if he were nothing more than a waiter interrupting a private conversation. The other board members followed suit, closing the circle, physically walling Brad out. Brad stood there, his hand hanging in midair, a frozen grin on his face. He looked around, checking if anyone had seen the snub. His stomach twisted. It was just a misunderstanding, he told himself. They didn't hear him. They were busy. He retreated to his family, his face burning. They are just discussing strategy. He lied to Beatrice, who was looking at him expectantly. I did not want to interrupt. Big things happening tonight. The lights in the ballroom suddenly dimmed, drawing a hush over the crowd. The string quartet faded into silence. A single spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the podium at the center of the stage. The murmur of conversation died down, replaced by a heavy, anticipatory silence. This was it. The moment the city had been waiting for. The reveal of the force behind the Onyx Capital takeover. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone. He was a grave man with a deep voice that commanded instant respect. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and employees of Vanguard, he began. Tonight marks the beginning of a new era. We have navigated turbulent waters, but we have found a new captain. It is my distinct honor to introduce the majority shareholder and the new chairwoman of the board representing Onyx Capital. Brad held his breath. He gripped Chloe's arm so hard she winced. He was expecting a stranger, a faceless investor from overseas, someone he could charm, someone he could lie to. Please welcome the MC, continued, his hand gesturing toward the velvet curtains at the side of the stage. Ms. Sophia Vance. The name hung in the air for a split second, incomprehensible. The brain refuses to process what it cannot accept. Brad blinked. Beatrice frowned, tilting her head as if she had heard a foreign language. Sophia. It couldn't be. Their Sophia was a failure. Their Sophia was probably crying in a gutter somewhere. It had to be a coincidence, a common name. And then the curtain parted. The woman who stepped into the spotlight was not the Sophia they knew. She was a vision of terrifying perfection. She was wearing a gown that looked like it had been woven from the night sky itself, a deep midnight blue silk that shimmered with every movement. It was a piece of haute couture that cost more than Brad's car, tailored to hug her form, like a second skin structured with sharp, dangerous lines that screamed power. Her hair, usually pulled back in a messy knot, was cascading in sleek, glossy waves over one shoulder. Her face was painted with a precision that highlighted the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the cold, diamond-hard resolve in her eyes. She didn't walk. She prowled. Every step was deliberate, commanding the attention of every soul in the room. She walked to the center of the stage and stood there, bathing in the light, looking down at the crowd with the imperious calm of a queen surveying her subjects. The reaction in the room was a ripple of polite applause, but in the center of the ballroom where the Vance family stood, there was a localized earthquake. Marcus was the first to break. He had been raising a glass of champagne to his lips, ready to toast the new boss. When he saw his daughter standing on that stage, looking like a goddess of vengeance, his fingers simply stopped working. The crystal flute slipped from his grasp. It hit the marble floor with a sound that seemed deafeningly loud in the quiet room, shattering into 1,000 glittering shards. Champagne splashed onto his polished shoes, but he didn't move. He stood with his mouth hanging open, his eyes bulging, his breath caught in a throat that had suddenly gone dry. Beatrice was a statue. She had stopped breathing. Her brain was short-circuiting, trying to reconcile the image of the daughter she had kicked out of her house in the rain with the woman standing on the stage. The realization hit her like a physical slap. The money, the power, the confidence. It had been there all along. She had thrown away a diamond because she thought it was a rock. Her face went pale, her lips trembling as she whispered a single horrified word. No. But it was Chloe who suffered the most public humiliation. She had been so busy preening for her live stream that she hadn't looked at the stage until the name was announced. When she looked up, phone still held high, her entire world collapsed. She saw Sophia. She saw the dress. She saw the undeniable truth that her scapegoat sister was actually the master of their universe. Her hand went limp. The phone slipped from her fingers, tumbling end over end until it hit the floor, the screen cracking into a spiderweb of fractures, the live stream cutting to black. Right? As thousands of people watched her face contort in shock. Sophia didn't speak immediately. She let the silence stretch. She let them look at her. Her eyes scanned the crowd until they locked onto the small, huddled group of her family. She saw the broken glass. She saw the broken phone. She saw the broken pride. She leaned into the microphone, her voice smooth, rich, and amplified to reach every corner of the room. "Good evening, everyone," she said, and her gaze never left Brad's terrified face. "It is a pleasure to finally welcome you to my company." Brad felt his knees give way. He grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself, but the room was spinning. The audit, the investigation, the trap. It was all her. The entire time she had been watching him. She had been the spider and he was just a fly who had flown right into the web, buzzing with arrogance until the very moment the fangs sank in. He looked at her, and for the first time in his life he didn't see a victim. He saw the executioner. And she was smiling. The room was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. The applause had died instantly, strangled by the sheer weight of the tension radiating from the stage. I stood at the podium, the microphone cool against my palm, looking down at the sea of faces that had morphed from adoring to confused. They were waiting for a speech about synergy and growth, about the bright future of Vanguard under Onyx Capital. They were expecting the usual corporate platitudes. Instead, I gave a small, imperceptible nod to the technician in the booth. Behind me, the massive LED screen that had been displaying the golden Vanguard logo flickered and changed. The gasps from the audience started in the front row and rippled back like a wave. It wasn't a slide about profit margins. It was a forensic flowchart. It was a complex, undeniable web of red lines connecting Vanguard's procurement department to a shell company called Apex Global Supplies. And right in the center of the web, enlarged for everyone to see, was a copy of a bank transfer authorization. It bore a signature that everyone in the room recognized, but the beneficiary account was one that belonged to the man currently gripping the back of a chair to keep from collapsing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth has a volume all its own. In the process of our due diligence for this acquisition, I began my voice steady and devoid of warmth. We uncovered a series of financial irregularities that could not be ignored. I pressed a button on the clicker. The screen zoomed in on a specific invoice. The one for the steel. The one with the 300% markup. We discovered that for the past 2 years, the Director of Operations, Mr. Brad Miller, has been systematically siphoning funds from this company. Through a network of phantom vendors and falsified invoices, Mr. Miller has embezzled approximately $1.2 million. The number hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. 1.2 million. It was a fortune to most people in that room, but to the board members, it was something worse than theft. It was a betrayal of their competence. They had let this happen under their noses. Brad let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. He stumbled forward, his face slick with sweat, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. "That is a lie!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "She is lying. She forged it. It is a setup." He looked at the board members, begging for an ally. "Arthur, you know me. I would never do this. She is trying to frame me because I fired her. She is crazy." But no one moved to help him. The evidence was literally 40 feet high behind me. The bank account numbers matched, the dates matched, and the desperation in his voice wasn't that of an innocent man. It was the panic of a guilty one who sees the walls closing in. "I am not finished," I said, cutting through his hysteria. I clicked the remote again. A video file appeared. It was grainy, taken from a hidden camera in an office ceiling. It showed Brad sitting at his desk, stuffing a thick envelope of cash into his briefcase, the very same cash he had accused me of stealing. The date stamp was from last week. The crowd murmured. The facade of the successful executive, the loving husband, the golden boy shattered in real time. He wasn't a VP. He was a petty thief in an expensive suit. Security, I said calmly. Please remove Mr. Miller from the premises. The economic police are waiting in the lobby to process his arrest. The double doors swung open, but it wasn't private security. It was 4 uniformed officers. They marched down the center aisle, the sound of their heavy boots providing a grim rhythm to Brad's destruction. No, you can't do this, Brad yelled, backing away, knocking over a table of hors d'oeuvres. Chloe, tell them, Marcus. Do something. Chloe stood frozen, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. She looked at her husband, then at the screen, then at me. She didn't move. She didn't scream for him. She simply watched, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the humiliation. The officers reached him. Brad tried to pull away, but they were efficient. They spun him around, slamming him against a pillar. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the ballroom, a sound finality that signaled the end of his career, his marriage, and his life as he knew it. I didn't look away. I watched as they dragged him out, his protests fading into incoherent sobbing. He looked back at me one last time, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and begging, but I offered him nothing. He had made his bed with greed and malice. Now he had to lie in it. When the doors closed behind him, the silence returned thicker than before. All eyes turned to the small group left standing in the wreckage of their reputation. Beatrice and Marcus. My mother looked like she was about to faint. She was clutching Marcus's arm, her face gray. Marcus was shaking, staring at the floor where his champagne glass had shattered. He knew what was coming next. He knew that his signature was on those documents too. He knew that technically he was an accomplice. He closed his eyes, waiting for the axe to fall. He waited for me to announce that Marcus Vance, the negligent director, was also being charged. He waited for the police to come back for him. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had failed to protect me, who had chosen the easy path every single time. I could destroy him. It would be easy. It would be justified. But then I remembered the fear in his eyes in the study. I remembered that he was a pawn, not a king. And I realized that destroying him wouldn't bring me peace. It would just make me like them. I raised the microphone again. However, I continued, my voice softening just a fraction. This investigation would not have been possible without the cooperation of a key insider. The room held its breath. Marcus opened his eyes, looking up at me in confusion. Mr. Marcus Vance, I lied smoothly, looking him dead in the eye. Though he was unaware of the depth of the deception initially, once he suspected the irregularities, he bravely provided the internal logs that allowed us to trace the funds. He chose the integrity of this company over personal loyalty. A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. Beatrice looked at Marcus, her mouth falling open. Chloe stopped crying for a second. Marcus stared at me, his lips trembling. He knew it was a lie. He knew I was rewriting history to save him. He knew I was giving him a lifeboat when he deserved to drown. Because of his years of service and his assistance in this difficult matter, I announced, ensuring the board heard every word, Mr. Vance will be allowed to take early retirement, starting tomorrow with his full pension and benefits intact. We thank him for his service. I started to clap. It was a slow, solitary sound at first. Then the board members, relieved that the scandal was contained to one bad apple, joined in. Then the rest of the room. Soon there was a polite round of applause for Marcus Vance, the hero who had helped catch the thief. Marcus didn't bow. He didn't smile. He looked at me across the ballroom, tears spilling from his eyes. They weren't tears of joy. They were tears of shame. He understood the magnitude of the gift I had just given him. I had saved his name. I had saved his financial future. but in doing so, I had taken something far more valuable: his pride. He would live the rest of his life knowing that he owed everything to the daughter he had cast aside. He was safe, but he was stripped bare. I nodded to him a single final acknowledgement. Then I turned my back on my family. I signaled the DJ. The music started again, a soft jazz number that tried to normalize the atmosphere. Waiters began to circulate with fresh champagne. The party resumed, as parties always do, the scandal already becoming gossip, the tragedy becoming an anecdote. I walked off the stage and into the shadows of the wings. My head of security met me there. "That was merciful, Ms. Vance," he said quietly. "It wasn't mercy," I replied, looking back at the ballroom where Marcus was now being comforted by a confused Beatrice. "It was a life sentence. He has to live with himself now. That is a punishment worse than prison." I walked toward the exit. The air outside would be cold, but for the first time in years, I felt warm. I had reclaimed my name. I had reclaimed my company. And I had broken the cycle. The revenge was sweet, yes. But the freedom was intoxicating. The fall of the House of Vance did not happen with a bang, but with the quiet, rhythmic scratching of a pen on a legal pad. The trial of Brad Miller was swift, brutal, and entirely devoid of the drama he so desperately craved. There were no last-minute saves, no surprise witnesses, and no charm offensives that could dismantle the mountain of forensic evidence I had piled against him. I sat in the back of the courtroom on the day of the sentencing, watching the back of his head. He had lost weight. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, and the arrogance that had once defined his posture was gone, replaced by a slump of defeat. When the judge read the sentence, 8 years in federal prison for embezzlement and fraud, Brad didn't scream. He didn't look at Chloe. He just closed his eyes and let the bailiffs lead him away. The golden boy was tarnished beyond repair, and the system he thought he could outsmart had swallowed him whole. The collateral damage was immediate. With Brad's assets frozen and his income gone, the facade of Chloe's perfect life crumbled within days. It turned out the house Brad claimed he was going to buy was just another lie. They were months behind on rent for their luxury apartment, and the eviction notice was pasted to the door before Brad had even processed into his cell. I heard through the grapevine that Chloe was selling her possessions. I didn't need to see it to picture it. The image of my sister, heavily pregnant and stripped of her vanity, standing at the counter of a high-end consignment shop, haggling over the price of the Birkin bags she used to dangle in my face. She was learning a hard lesson about the difference between net worth and self-worth, a lesson I had mastered years ago in the silence of my exile. 3 weeks after the sentencing, the concierge of my building called up to the penthouse. He sounded hesitant. "Ms. Vance, there is a couple here to see you. Marcus and Beatrice Vance. They say they are your parents. I told them you have a strict no-visitor policy, but they are insisting." I stood by the window looking out at the city that now felt like my kingdom. I could have turned them away. I could have told security to escort them off the premises, to let them feel the sting of rejection the way I had felt it that rainy night in the driveway. But curiosity, or perhaps a desire for closure, got the better of me. "Send them up," I said. When the elevator doors slid open, they looked small. That was the first thing I noticed. The penthouse was designed to be imposing with its vaulted ceilings and panoramic views, and my parents looked like tourists who had wandered into a museum where they didn't belong. Marcus was walking with a cane, now his posture stooped. Beatrice, usually so immaculate, had a fray in the hem of her coat, a detail she would have fired a maid for missing in the past. They stood in the foyer, afraid to step onto the marble floors, looking around with a mixture of awe and shame. "Sophia," Marcus said, his voice cracking. It was a broken sound. He took a step forward, his eyes filling with tears. "This place, it is incredible. You built all of this." I didn't offer them a drink. I didn't invite them to sit. I stood by the kitchen island, my arms crossed, creating a physical barrier between my world and theirs. I replied simply. What do you want? Beatrice flinched at the coldness in my tone. She twisted her hands together, looking down at her feet. We just wanted to see you. We wanted to talk. Chloe is moving back in with us. The baby is due next month. We are struggling, Sophia. The legal fees for Brad, the debts he left behind. It has wiped us out. I watched them, feeling a strange hollowness in my chest. I waited for the anger to flare up, but it wasn't there. Just a dull, aching pity. You want money? I stated, cutting through the preamble. No, Marcus said quickly, shaking his head. No, that is not why we are here. I mean, yes, we are in trouble, but... He looked up at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw genuine regret in his eyes. I looked at you for 30 years, and I didn't see you. I saw what I wanted to see. I saw a spare part. I saw someone to manage, not someone to lead. I bet everything on Brad. I bet everything on Chloe. And I was wrong. I was so wrong. You were the one, Sophia. You were the strong one. You were the loyal one. And I treated you like garbage. He began to weep ugly, racking sobs that shook his frail body. Beatrice put a hand on his shoulder, crying silently. I am sorry, Sophia, she whispered. We are so sorry. I let them cry. I let the apology hang in the air, heavy and overdue. But as I watched them, I realized that while forgiveness is possible, forgetting is not. An apology does not erase the years of neglect. It does not undo the night they kicked me out. It does not rewrite the narrative of a lifetime of being the black sheep. I walked over to the desk and picked up a folder I had prepared. I walked back and held it out to Marcus. This is a trust fund, I said. It is for the baby. It covers medical expenses for the delivery, health insurance, and an educational fund that unlocks when the child turns 18. There is also a monthly stipend for childcare essentials. Diapers, formula, clothes. Beatrice reached for it, her hands trembling. Oh, Sophia. Thank you. We can be a family again. You can come over for Sunday dinner. We can start over. We will set a place for you. The best place. I pulled the folder back slightly before she could take it. No, I said firmly. You misunderstand. This money is for the innocent child who didn't ask to be born into this mess. It is not for you. It is not for Chloe's shopping addiction. And it is certainly not an admission ticket back into my life. Marcus looked at me, confusion clouding his tear-filled eyes. But we are family. We want you back. I am not coming back, Dad. I said, my voice steady and final. I am not coming to Sunday dinner. I am not going to sit there and pretend that the last 30 years didn't happen just because you are sorry now that you are broke. I have built a life here. A life where I am respected. A life where I am safe. And I will not invite the toxicity of the past into my future. I handed the folder to Beatrice. Take this. Care for the baby. But do not call me. Do not come here again. Marcus looked at me with a desperate, pleading expression. Sophia, please, don't be like this. You are my daughter. You belong at the table with us. We can make room. I looked at him and I smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile, but it was a sad one. It was the smile of a woman who had finally realized her own value. I am not a leech, Dad, I said softly. I am the one in charge. And the person in charge sits at the head of the table or eats alone. I turned and walked toward the window, signaling that the meeting was over. Behind me, I heard the soft shuffle of their feet, the quiet click of the door closing, and then the silence returned. I looked out at the city lights, feeling a profound sense of peace. I was alone in the penthouse, but I wasn't lonely. I was free. And for the first time, the view from the top didn't look scary. It looked like home. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to save yourself? It is the hardest decision you will ever make, but sometimes it is the only way to survive. If my story of revenge and redemption resonated with you, please hit that like button and share this video. You never know who needs to hear that they are strong enough to walk away and build their own empire. Subscribe for more stories of truth, justice, and the power of standing your ground. Thank you for listening. The most profound lesson from Sophia's story is that self-worth is non-negotiable and intrinsic. She endured years of humiliation, not because she was weak, but because she was strategically biding her time. Her ultimate victory wasn't just about exposing financial fraud, it was about exposing the fragility of a family built on greed and superficial appearances. We often fear losing family, but Sophia showed us that losing toxic connections is actually a gain. Real power is realizing you don't need a seat at a table where you aren't respected, you have the strength to build your own. If you believe in the power of self-respect and justice, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it today.